countries. I just wanted to acknowledge a number of people from whom I've taken some slides. Key among them, Poverty Action Lab at MIT, but also Nava Ashraf, Rachel Glenister, and Lakahala Scott Lee and Sam Asher helped with these slides. There's been a resurgence of field research in developing countries in the past 15 years. Many of you will be familiar with some papers in this area. You can think of Esther Duflo's work on women as policymakers. You can think of the Progressa work on conditional cash transfers, which started in Mexico, but through randomized evaluation, we're able to quite definitively establish the impact of this program. And as a result, it was adopted, broadened in Mexico and adopted in 30-some other countries. There's been work that has had a big influence on questions that were very difficult to get at, and of a lot of theoretical interest, like Carlin and Zinman's work on moral hazard versus adverse selection. There's the series of papers on creditor-shareholder protection around the world, also based on primary data and on regulation and other things. So this work has had a lot of impact. This talk is really designed to provide some practical sort of how-to tips on how to do this. And there's in the morning, I'm going to talk about field research in developing countries, things like survey design, a bunch of sort of very nuts and bolts issues like that. In the afternoon, I'm going to focus on randomized evaluations in developing countries. So obviously, when you're doing a randomized evaluation, you also have to worry about survey design. So the first set of issues will be applicable to randomized evaluations as well, but also applicable to studies like to things like Andre Schleifer's work or Chris Udry's work, which is not using that technique typically. Okay. So let me start off with the question. So some of you are already committed to this field, but some of you haven't yet drunk the Kool-Aid. So let me sort of talk about the pluses and minuses of conducting field work and development, and then go through some practical issues on survey design. I'll focus on, there's obviously questions for measurement for a whole bunch of different areas. Some issues come up when you're looking at consumption or profits of small businesses in developing countries, which have very different types of record keeping than businesses in developed countries. Talk about attrition issues. There are a bunch of 7, 8, and 9 are a bunch of practical issues. I may move them up depending on how timing is going. And then talk about some recent work suggesting that the act of measurement may in fact affect behavior, which this is the mere measurement effects, which is of concern for a lot of empirical work. Okay. So, whether to do field work in development, well, there's two questions. First, whether to work on development. As a development economist, I guess I'm biased on this one. But one reason to work on development is that's where most people in the world are, roughly 80% of people. There's also the problems are particularly important. If you think that if you've got a log utility, then the value of a little bit more consumption in the developing world is going to be very high. But at the same time, there's much less research in the developing world. And here's a quote, some statistics from a paper by Dosto, Shanes, and Srinivasan. So just hugely more papers on rich countries than poor countries. It turns out, by the way, the U.S. may not be that much of an outlier. This may just be largely explained by a straight GDP relationship. But poor countries have a lot less research on them. Okay. Now, another reason, aside from the importance of the problems and the relative scarcity of research, is that there's some opportunities to do things in developing countries that might be difficult or more expensive elsewhere. So there's some types of data that you can get that might be difficult to get elsewhere. So for example, this is a natural randomized experiment, but it turns out that there's randomization on who goes on the Hajj. It's very difficult. People have come up with very interesting identification strategies for getting the effect of religion in our society, but you don't have that many randomized, natural randomized experiments. Or somebody who just recently graduated from the Kennedy schools from Vietnam, he just asked a big firm in Vietnam for data on the bribes they paid, and they happily handed it over. They kept very good records of this. So there's sort of some data that you can get that you wouldn't be able to get elsewhere. Okay. It's also just cheaper. So if you're interested in experiments, which I'll mostly talk about in the afternoon, it's often just much cheaper to run these experiments in a developing country. Surveyors it's much cheaper to hire survey enumerators. And the cost of intervention, to make a difference a substantial difference in the per pupil spending in the US, it's going to be, for a significant number of pupils or schools, fantastically expensive beyond most of our research budgets. It's actually quite doable in developing country study. It's also because NGOs, that's development speak for nonprofit organizations, they play a huge role in a lot of developing countries. And so they can be spending amounts that are very significant relative to government budgets. And they're not expected to serve the entire country. So you can get a lot of variation from that, either non-experimental variation, or as I'll talk about in the second half, there's scope for experimental variation. And of course, they don't have all of the constraints that governments can do. They're more free to try new things. Okay. So suppose you want to work on development. Should you do field research? Okay, this, I think there's a certain sense in which the wave of field research has been so influential, people sometimes assume that if you're going to work in development, you have to do field experiments or field work. I don't think that's the case. There's a lot that can be done with existing data sets. And there's more and more data sets that are available. There's many of them. I'm just putting up a couple here, but there's DHS and LSMS surveys. These are household surveys from many countries around the world that are set up in comparable ways and are available electronically. And there's increasingly firm studies as well. If those are sufficient to answer your question, then that's definitely the way to go. Collecting your own data is it's very time-consuming, both in the sense of it takes a lot of time for it to happen, also takes a lot of your time as a researcher. It's also risky. You can be doing this and it can turn out your data's no good, or you can't collect your data after spending lots of time developing your questionnaires. So, if you can use existing data sets, that's definitely the way to go. Okay. One caveat to that is, I think if you're interested in working in development, not so much as a one-off project, but on a longer-term basis, it's useful to have experience in developing country. That just helps in figuring out what questions to ask and thinking about what the hypothesis should be. It also helps in sort of reality testing certain data. If you see, should you believe data on the number of kids who are enrolled in school, or should you even think about is the question of enrollment in school the right concept, or is it just kids sometimes go in and out of school, and so you need data on whether kids are there on a particular day? That's something you'll have a feel for if you've spent time in a developing country. Might not be otherwise. But you don't have to get that experience by doing field research in developing countries. You might be from a developing country. You might have spent significant time there as a Peace Corps volunteer, or you might have relatives there. But if you are going to do field research, where to do it? So just to come back to this, so if you do want to work in development, and aside from the particular question you're answering, if you don't have that sort of on-the-ground experience, it's probably a good idea to pick it up at some point in your career, but doesn't have to be immediately. Okay. Where to do field research? Well, I think it's always easier to do it in a place you already know. So if you're from a country, it's easier. It makes sense to strongly consider doing it there. And if you think about some of the, there are lots of examples of very nice work done from people who are from a particular country. For example, the work on property rights in Argentina, or the work on water privatization in Argentina by Shergrodsky and Ditella and Galliani. If you're doing multiple projects, there's a lot of advantages. So a lot of my work is in Kenya. I think there are a lot of advantages to, some people, Dean Carlin will be doing work in 15 different countries at the same time. I think, at least in my case, I find it easier to stick to try and concentrate it, just to cut down on fixed costs of travel and also of learning about a particular society. You can think about where collaborators and survey infrastructure are available. Those are pretty important in doing work. Rural versus urban areas. In rural areas, transport costs can eat up a lot of your budget, getting from one household that you're surveying to another. In urban areas, you may be able to reduce those costs, but there may be other issues of safety or crime. Enumerator salaries might be higher. Okay. What are reasons not to collect field data? Well, I've mentioned some of these already. Just to go on into a bit more detail, there's a real, you're dependent on permission from the governments and from permission from the people who are giving you the data. And there can be, that takes, just as in when you're collecting any data, that requires a lot of face time, and sometimes you can think everything's going well, and then it ends. You also may be relying on a survey firm in a society where there may not be that many survey firms, and you may get delays on that end. Data quality can go wrong. You can realize you made a mistake in your data collection and need to go back. There's the risk of natural disasters or human disasters. The post-election violence in Kenya required an interruption in field work for several months. And there's lots of management, so it's time-consuming. So it's not something to get into too lightly. But okay, if you are collecting data, there are a lot of different potential methods of collecting this. So it's typically useful to start off with some sort of qualitative research to think about what the possible hypotheses might be. To the extent that you can find existing administrative records, that can make your life a lot easier. They typically have very high coverage. So if you're, but it's worth spending some time trying to understand that data. Sometimes there'll be official incentives will distort those. So for example, in India, schools will get subsidies per child enrolled, so they want to report very high enrollment. That enrollment doesn't necessarily mean something. Or it could just be lack of incentives. They may not bother to collect the data accurately. Attendance data, maybe the teachers are just filling that out at the end of the month or the end of the semester. Surveys cost more than getting administrative data, and they allow you to develop the questions you need. But one problem is people may distort their true preferences. So if you're asking about sensitive questions, say sexual behavior, you may have problems. It's true preferences or behavior. Some things that are worth considering, that satellite data is increasingly available and can be used for more and more things. So there's papers that you can use this to get at forest cover if you're interested in an issue like deforestation. Turns out I'm interested in, Esther Duflo and John Robinson and I are interested in fertilizer use. So we were thinking, well, we go out and we survey farmers about whether they're using fertilizer. And when we were doing sort of small things, this was doable. But we're now thinking about trying to get at social interactions and learning, so we might want to get at this at a large scale. I just learned, I'm not sure this is going to be right, but two real scientists as opposed to us economists have told me that you can actually find out how much fertilizer has been used through satellite photographs. They can figure out how much nitrogen is in crops. So there's more and more that can be done with survey data. Obviously, it's a way to get a lot of data at reasonable cost. Very big setup costs in using fertilizer data. It takes, in using satellite data, but it may be useful. GPS, when you're doing surveys, it makes sense to get GPS locations. Another way to get data is to generate your own administrative data. So for example, if you're handing out coupons if you want to understand take-up of a product, you can hand out coupons for that product, and then you can have data on redemption of those coupons. And that can be cheaper than actually going around and surveying people. Okay, and obviously you're getting actual behavior. And finally, you can do some things that are trying to combine, sort of coming from the social experiment tradition, where a lot of the development field experiments come out of, and the lab experiment tradition, you can ask people to play games. And there's now a fair amount of evidence that those are quite correlated with real-world behavior certainly in social experiments, but more broadly. They can be, it's expensive to do those, and you obviously need to know what you're doing and think about what you're measuring in this particular context. One issue that may be more of an issue that applies, I think, in a developing country context, applies to games. It probably applies to certainly applies to surveys as well. People may be answering questions with hoping to get aid. So aid in many developing countries is quite significant, and people may, and because there's so many NGOs out there, they may be trying to answer strategically, and they may be trying. Possibly, they might be trying to play games strategically, although we don't know that for sure. You can also hold, if you're interested in sometimes you're interested in political or social processes. These are often very difficult to get random variation on in a developed country context, but in a developing country context, sometimes you can get lots of interesting variation with this. So there's a whole set of community-driven development projects out there. So this is very popular among certain development donors right now, which is ways of organizing the community, having discussions to get them to decide on what development projects to do. And there's a view that this is going to help lead to better, to improve social capital, and that will show up in more participatory decision-making in other contexts. Okay, it's a whole theory. Who knows whether it's right. If you're interested in those issues, you can actually observe political processes. So that's obviously quite expensive to do. But you can, if you're sitting in on these meetings, and you can get a lot of data. And it's a situation where people have incentives to, I would say, costly for people to hide their true preferences. Maybe that's the wrong way of putting it. People may be behaving strategically in a political situation for all the usual reasons, but it's costly for them to behave strategically to impress the enumerator. So you can observe a village meeting and see, for example, are women speaking in the meeting. So this is something that Esther Duflo and Rohini Pandey have looked at and shown that in villages in India where there's been reservations, the Indian word for affirmative action for women, so a woman has been the leader of the village. Later, they show that women are more likely to speak up in meetings afterwards. Okay. To do this, you're going to need the same type of event held both in the the treatment and comparison areas, and you need to know when the event's going to happen so you can show up to observe it. But it can be a useful way of collecting data. So in addition to sort of the standard surveys, in addition to surveys and games, you can observe actual political outcomes. Okay. Okay. Let me talk about a few different types of. Let me talk about some general issues on survey design, and then I'll go through looking at some particular areas. Okay. So in thinking about surveys, you first have to start out with what hypotheses you want to test, and then think about what variables or combination of variables you need to test those hypotheses. It's typically good, rather than making up questions from scratch, to sort of check existing surveys. And there are a lot of them out there. They're online, everything from the World Values Survey to lots of sort of household consumption surveys that have been put together by the World Bank and others. It's generally good if you're to think about not just the final variables, but also some of the pathways and get the intermediate variables. And if you're trying to collect data in an area where others have expertise, say medical area, it's very useful to get advice from them. Let me give you an example. This example from the US, but in the Moving to Opportunity study, they wanted to get just anthropometric data, height and weight of people. You would think that getting people's weight is a pretty straightforward thing to do. Do you really need to bring in the doctors to tell you how to measure somebody's weight? It turns out that actually getting weight is pretty tricky. And in the US case, the people had difficulty, the survey enumerators had difficulty with, there were pounds and there were kilograms on the scale. they got messed up, and it was very hard to use this data. They may have eventually fixed that problem. It was a significant problem for them at the time. And certainly, we've had, in my own work, we've had problems getting that very basic height and weight data. So one reason is experts can help you get it better. But a second reason is if you're interested in communicating with beyond economists to a broader audience, the doctors may just not listen to you if you're not using the right type of scale. In many cases, I think we economists are right. This is if there's noise on the if there's noise on the left-hand side of the equation, with them, we don't have to worry about it that much. But that doesn't mean the doctors are going to see it that way, and you may want to communicate with them. Education's obviously that's another area where I've worked, where there's a lot of expertise among experts in that area. Obviously, there's costs of doing this, of bringing this in, and how much you want to spend, how much effort you want to spend depends on the size of your survey and the important centrality of this variable. There's very much. I think one thing that needs to be done more is I'm going to be many guidebooks on sort of doing field work are sort of lists of do everything under the sun without worrying about budget constraints, and I'm going to be a little bit guilty of that myself. But I think a step forward in thinking about these issues would be to sort of be very explicit about budget constraints. And we started to hear some of that in the previous talk about when you're thinking about sample size. But doing that more I think is something we need to do. Okay, so actually that's my next slide. Considering the constraints. So you have to think about how long do you want the survey to be. How you have to trade off the number of observations you have against the length of each observation with a fixed budget. You also have to think about what's the capacity of your enumeration team, and what's the capacity of the respondents to provide the information, their willingness and their ability. Now, in general, people in developing countries are much more willing. They have a lot more patience in answering questions than people in rich countries. We just you get the phone call and you hang up. Generally, the poorer somebody is, the more willing they are to spend time with a survey firm. So if you're doing farmers in developing countries, they'll spend a lot more time than if you're doing shopkeepers. So there is more room there in the developing country setting, but there's still some important issues. First, people may not be willing to provide accurate information, and in that case, you may want to try to find proxy variables. So Esther Duflo, Pascaline Dupas, Samuel Senet, and I were involved in a project looking at HIV/AIDS education, and we thought that might lead that treatment. This was a randomized evaluation. We thought the treatment there might lead people to self-report safe sex or no sex. So we looked at pregnancy data instead, thinking that risky sex can lead to AIDS. It can also lead to pregnancy. And this was a primary school population, so we thought that might be an okay proxy. There are problems with that as a proxy. It's not that that's a separate discussion, but thinking about things that are that are sort of harder to fake might make sense. Okay. I think it's also worth noting that people's where possible, if you can get objective outcomes, that's desirable. So Ben Olkins did work on corruption in Indonesia. A lot of the corruption perception work finds that ethnically heterogeneous societies have more corruption, and that had even been used as an instrument it turns out that in Ben's work, he actually looks at corruption in road building. He actually takes a sample from the road to see how much of different types of material had been applied there to measure the amount of corruption relative to what was the amount of material that was supposed to be there. That's one common form of corruption. Turns out that there's a systematic measurement error. Ethnically more diverse villages report more corruption, holding constant the actual amount of corruption. So to the extent that you can get harder data, that's useful. Okay. I mentioned using publicly available instruments. You may need to adapt those, okay, just for the local society. Let's move over this a little bit further. It often makes sense to design a questionnaire by module. So rather than sort of skip around from topic to topic, I don't know whether I'm doing that in this lecture, but a well-designed lecture or a well-designed questionnaire will tend to cover one topic at a time, and that makes it easier both for the enumerator and for the respondent. Usually, so you see something here called metadata. That's things like when was the interview conducted, who was the enumerator. It's very useful to keep that. If you later find out one of your enumerators is making up data, you want to know who did which interview, for example. You also might want to test for enumerator effects, or does it make a difference if there's a male or female enumerator asking the question. Collecting the household roster early makes sense. That's before people have lost patience with you. When you're on, cousin number 15, if later, if you get a list of all the cousins or all the people living in the household, and there's, eight of them, then later when you're asking how much time did each person spend collecting firewood, you haven't left somebody out. Okay? Makes sense to start the questionnaire with some straightforward things. If you're going to be asking about sexual behavior or which political party did you vote for, probably put that towards the end so you get as much data from people as possible. Okay. Even though people in developing countries are often more patient in answering questionnaires, you get surveys that are 5 to 6 hours in some cases that the World Bank does. You should still try to keep this under control. If you can do it faster, that's good. You should write out your questions. These are just some common sense things, but they're, I think it's worth spending some time on them. So the interviewer can read them verbatim. You don't want each interviewer sort of taking some question like main occupation and translating it his or her own way, because then you may get very different questions asked to different people. The whole idea of occupation, for example, isn't as simple in a developing country where lots of people are doing sort of 4 or 5 different jobs at the same time. They're farmers, but they're also in the off-season doing some trading, for example. If you can, if you keep questions simple and singular, sort of rather than asking sort of complicated and/or questions, that makes sense. So breaking them up. Okay. It's worth specifying who's the preferred respondent. So when the survey enumerator shows up at the household, who do they ask for? And that depends on the question you're asking and on the way the society is structured. But typically, if you're interested in child health, you probably want to find the mother of the youngest child, for example. If you're asking about expenditure, maybe the household head. Okay. It's good to write up a guidebook or a manual with precise definitions of what you mean by things. What's a household that's complicated in a society, for example, where there might be polygamy? And do you mean the mother and her children plus the husband, or do you mean all of the co-wives? Having instructions within the questionnaire for the enumerator, often sort of broken off typographically, either all capitals or italics or something like that, can be quite useful, including skip codes. If yes, then skip to question 37. And definitely pre-code the questions. Try and use as much consistency as possible. You don't want one to mean yes some places and no other places, and male and female should be coded similarly. You clearly want don't know questions, don't know codes. So if the questionnaire is going to be, if the questionnaire is going to be administered in other languages, probably write it I'm assuming that you'll be writing your questionnaire originally in English. Maybe that won't be the case, but if you're writing it originally in English, then translate it to have someone translate it to, say, Swahili or whatever the language will be, and then have somebody back translate it. And then look at the back translation and see if it corresponds to the original. Okay? You obviously have to field test the instrument as well. Okay? You often find that it's a few questions which are causing your enumerators most of the trouble in the interview. And sort of talking to the enumerators, which questions are problematic and how can you improve them, can be very valuable. I mean, the enumerators are a very good source of information. Okay. Let me give some examples here. This example from Sierra Leone. They asked people, what groups are you a member of? and somebody said, I'm not a member of any group. Well, then, if you develop a list of groups, what they switched to was they developed a list of all the groups, the religious groups or credit associations, rotating credit associations. If you have a list of the groups and you say, are you a member of this group? Are you a member of that group, et cetera? That's a much better way of collecting data. And in this case, they may not have wanted to say this for fear that they may have been hoping to get aid. Okay, here's a case where somebody said that they were community members said they were involved in a decision, even though the enumerators had seen the person who made the decision make it without consulting them. So there are a number of issues you have to think about. Okay, measuring consumption. So the standard question to ask to get at socioeconomic status in a rich country would be income. Typically people measure income rather than consumption. And in a society like the United States, where most people are getting a regular salary or wage, it's very easy to, it's well defined. People will know it. So it's much more expensive in a U.S. context to measure consumption. People are consuming all sorts of things. In developing countries, it's much more typical to measure consumption. Obviously, these are theoretically very different concepts. There's some theoretical advantages of consumption that's smoother. People may be more, but there's also a bunch of practical things. People may be less reluctant to share information on it. If they're worried of asking somebody how much money they made, they may be worried about taxes, or are you going to try and take some from me, or my neighbor is going to find out and ask me for money. It's also quite conceptually difficult if people are running some sort of small-scale business, because they're what's personal, what's business is quite complicated. Obviously, you get the same issue showing up when you're trying to measure business profits. Okay. Consumption's generally easier because people often aren't consuming that many different things. You clearly want to get at home consumption, sometimes in-kind consumption from employers, consumptions from stock, from what you had at home. Okay. Let me skip about price data, but that can be an important issue. Okay, I'm going to skip over this a little bit. One issue is how long, what recall period to ask for. So you can have people are more likely to remember consumption over a short period. What did I eat yesterday as opposed to what did I eat over the last week? Yeah, on the other hand, there's more variation, random variation in what you ate yesterday. Maybe if you have meat once a week, maybe it was a day you had meat, maybe it wasn't. So it's nice if you're just concerned about averages, you can just have a short recall period, and it'll average out across the respondents. On the other hand, if you're interested in getting at higher moments of the distribution, then you might need to ask about longer periods. If you want to get what's the distribution of meat eating, and if everybody's eating meat once a week, you'd falsely conclude that some people are eating meat if you only asked about yesterday, you might falsely conclude some people eat meat every day and some people never eat meat. Okay. Clearly, you want as much consistency across your different modules as possible. These aren't just theoretical concerns, quite huge differences. So, the cheapest way to, as Angus Deaton has shown, sort of the cheapest way to reduce poverty in India would just be to reduce the recall period, right? So moving on to perhaps even harder challenges. If you're trying to get data on firms, I'll focus here on small firms, but I think there's going to be another set of issues for larger firms. A little bit of a digression there. I think there's a lot of a lot of the research is focused on micro enterprises, but obviously there's a lot of room for additional research on larger firms. So most firms, so DeMel, McKinsey, and Woodruff are thinking about very small firms are not keeping records, not paying taxes. They're moving money back and forth all the time between household and business accounts. Businesses in general will have lags between their expenses and their revenue. And I think in either small or large firms, the owners may be very reluctant to share information. The large firms, probably are very worried about taxes and government. There's issues about how you value family time. Small firms, family members are probably doing most or all of the work. How do you value their time? If they're sitting there watching, somebody's watching the store and watching their kid, how do you value, should you attribute when you're calculating profits for this firm, what wage rate do you attribute to them? So they did a bookkeeping experiment where they asked firms to keep ledger books, and they had people come and observe the firms. They found big gaps between, if you take the reported revenues, reported expenses, sort of took the gap, you found that did not do too well. And in fact, the correlation between profits and the difference between expenses and revenues was, under 0.5. So they argue that you should just ask. I haven't done work in this area myself, so I'm not really, competent to judge. But those people who've worked on this a bit think it's better to just simply ask about profits straight out. Okay. I'm going to skip ahead to some data collection issues here, and then before coming back to attrition. So it's good to, there's lots of opportunities for things to go wrong in data collection. So you want data supervisors who check the work of the interviewers. And you need a checklist for that of things they should check. Was everything filled out that should be, for example? They should also do some revisits. If you're doing collection in multiple rounds, get the GPS location, get some data on questions that shouldn't change over time so you can check it. Okay? You should definitely do a pilot. Okay? And often in the pilot, you'll find out additional things. Sorry, I had some problems with my slides, so there's a little bit of repetition here. You might want to randomize the order in which some things about your data collection process. The order in which you ask questions, the characteristics of the enumerators, how frequently you collect the data. And if you find that the answers are varying a lot, that's a red flag. Data entry is another place where you have to put in a fair amount of attention. It makes sense to enter data as quickly as possible. Ideally, you've got this going in real time so that you can, if there are problems, you can catch them. If you wait if your data gets entered 6 months after all the interviews are done, then if there was a problem with the way your interviews were being done, it's too late to change it. Okay? Now, the real way to do that, and what clearly I think people will be doing in the future, is collecting the data and skipping the data entry step altogether. The data would go immediately into a laptop or a PDA or into a cell phone, and straight to a database. The kinks in all those systems haven't necessarily been ironed out. So, a number of people I know most people I know are still using paper survey forms in developing countries. But I hope that will change soon. Clearly, you want to have a good data entry base to reduce data entry error. Do the double entry of the data, and then do some checks. Okay. And then, do data cleaning after that to look for problems. Okay, let me come back to these budget issues. Let me come back to. Okay. So attrition, if you're doing a panel survey, so if you're doing a randomized evaluation, most of the time you're going to want a baseline and an end line. But even if it's not a randomized evaluation, it's often people want longitudinal data. In developed countries, the main reason you get attrition is because people say, I'm sick of you, I don't want to be interviewed anymore. That's much less likely in developing country. But on the other hand, it can be hard to find somebody. Because households are splitting up, consolidating. There's a lot of migration, a lot of temporary migration. People go to the city to work for a while. And addresses may not exist in a codified form. You might also get that the enumerators don't feel like they're not willing to talk to somebody of high status. So many surveys don't keep a lot of records of attrition. So clearly you should keep track of that. Here's some data from Thomas, Frankenberg, and Smith. They show that there's a systematic relationship. This is in Indonesia between the likelihood of attrition and income. Okay? Tends to be the higher income people who are going to go move in this case. Okay? Very low income and also the higher people. So if they were interested in what are the trends in income in their sample over time, they would get that wrong if they're not accounting for attrition. Okay, but the other thing that they showed, so they just took sort of a maniacal approach to we're going to minimize attrition and we're going to find people. So what they did was they got information from neighbors, relatives, community leaders to try and find out where they are. If they were in the local area, during the field work, they tried to find them. If they'd moved, then they sort of collected a bunch of names and then they went to go find them. So I've been involved in similar things in Kenya with, Ted Miguel has taken the lead on. When you do that, you can actually get, with some effort, and it is a lot of effort and expense, but you can get quite high follow-up rates. And some of the work that Thomas has done suggests this makes a real difference. Okay, but it raised the total budget by 20%. Whether that's going to be important may depend on what you're doing. Okay. Cell phones, I think, are going to make this a lot easier over time. Okay, you can collect, but asking, you can also ask for people have lots of relatives. So in the initial survey, you can say, okay, who in your family who would know, in your family or elsewhere, would know where you might be if you're not here, and do you have a cell phone number for them? You can also budget for tracking initially. Okay, there's various things you can do to adjust for attrition, obviously, if it doesn't work out. I'm going to come back to these mirror measurement effects. Let me discuss a couple more. Couple more administrative issues beforehand. No, sorry, I'll go back in. Okay, so attrition is one thing. That can be handled. Here's something that I think is quite worrisome. And this is new work that's being done by a variety of authors. I think some of this started with Dean Carlin and Jonathan Zinman. This is work that suggests that surveying people can affect behavior. So generally what they're doing here is they have some data, some random variation in who was surveyed or in the frequency with which they were surveyed. And then they have some administrative data or other objective data on take-up of some product, like a financial product, an insurance product, or a health product. So in 4 out of 5 of the cases they looked at, and this is not, this is not yet complete work. Maybe it'll turn out, maybe it'll change. They found that the people who were surveyed were significantly more likely to take up the product. So in other words, if you get surveyed about health, you're more likely to take up health insurance later. Okay? This wasn't a survey that was pushing you to take up health insurance. So they found this for health in the Philippines, for microcredit in Morocco, microloans in India. So there's a large group of people who may wind up with a joint paper on this. Let me see if Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee are involved. I've got this in some other section of my slide, which I can't find. I may be involved as well. I'd been doing, I don't know whether it'll be a single paper or not, but let me tell you about the work that we did. So I've been doing work on water treatment and diarrhea. So there's a huge, so basically we were studying the effect of cleaner water on diarrhea. Diarrhea kills 2 million kids a year, so it's a very big health problem. And so we collected data the way economists would normally do it. We got a large sample of people and we interviewed them about diarrhea. It turns out the public health people think that the way they typically do things is they have a smaller sample and they go back every 2 weeks. Short recall periods are relevant. So we went back and tried to do it the public health way, having not adequately taken the advice here of sort of learning about the way people in the field do it. It turned out, well, I'll argue we economists were right in this case. But so we had biweekly prevalence measures, and we had these sort of annual data from a comparable population. It was random which type of data collection we had. So if you look at this sort of solid line, these are the ones that had biweekly monitoring. So you see that diarrhea prevalence sort of falls a lot over time. Okay, that could be seasonal effects. Is there flooding? Is it the rainy season or the dry season? But what we noticed was these households that were getting less frequent monitoring, which should have been totally comparable, These were all comparison, there were treatments going on, but these are all comparison households. They had much higher levels of reporting. So reporting went down from 20% to 5%. Okay? And that's, and if you look at the households that had less frequent monitoring, it's sort of at the 10% level. So it looks like the very act of asking people about diarrhea is changing their reported diarrhea. Now, that could be for two reasons. Could be that it's changing their reporting behavior. They know that if you say, yes, my kid had diarrhea, then you get a whole bunch of extra questions. You know, was there blood in the stool, et cetera. Maybe people aren't so excited about discussing all those things, so they just say, no, my kid didn't have diarrhea. But it turns out that it's not just that. It seems to have changed actual behavior, not just reporting error. Because we tested their water to see if there was chlorine in their water. And people who had more frequent questions about diarrhea were more likely to have chlorine in their water. So they were more. So the very fact of measuring seems to affect behavior. This is, as I said earlier, this is an issue not just for randomized evaluations, but it's an issue for data collection more generally. One way to deal with this, one lesson we took from this is, this may be a problem even with infrequent data collection, but the more frequent the data collection, the more a problem it is. Okay. Okay. I talked about data collection and management already. Talk a little bit about some very practical things about budgeting and finance for these. So it's important to, there's a real trap of not budgeting adequately for these. So it's very easy to sort of work out a bare bones budget, but not include any overhead for the people who are doing this, not allow for things to go wrong, not, sort of assume that the existing exchange rate's going to be there, that your enumerators are going to be, that they can do 4 surveys a day, and that they can do that every day, when in fact there's going to be some days when the roads you can't get out because the roads are too muddy, or because there's a scheduling problem of some other sort. You'll need to resurvey some people because you'll find that you had a mistake in the questionnaire probably. Those are all things that can go wrong, but there are also things that can go right. You may have opportunities to do some new things that are very exciting with a little bit of extra budget. So it's better to don't promise too much, or you'll find yourself in a difficult situation. Okay, what are some funding sources? I've put the NSF up there. I'm putting that up there not so much because it's a big funder for this sort of thing, but because that's what probably most economists are familiar with. The funders for this type of work are often very different in a lot of ways. Let me start with the NIH, which might be, which like the NSF is going to be thinking about this from a scientific point of view. So the NIH relative, I hope I'm not going to, offend people here and end any future funding. But the NIH relative to the NSF they're very detail oriented. So they're going to, they'll want a lot of details on exactly how you're going to do everything. And you often have to go through multiple rounds with the NIH. So it's not, don't get too discouraged if you applied the NIH and you get turned down. That's standard, and you typically have to come back. There's some word that might be changing. I don't know whether it actually has. Okay. The other two funders I have up here, and obviously there are lots of other ones, are even more different. So the World Bank has a research department which has some funding, but there's also a lot of potential operational funding in the World Bank. There, it's very different than either of these research funders. Their ultimate job is development, not research. And they're bureaucratically quite different, and they have lots of different pots of money. This may be true for any funder. There's special programs at the NIH or NSF where they have a particular topic. But those are likely to be very tightly delimited at the World Bank. They have a pot of money. The World Bank you think of as having some large, billions of dollars, but they actually have, lots of money in different accounts for very particular purposes. This is for vocational education in Tanzania. So if you happen to be doing something on vocational education in Tanzania, you might be able to access that money. But the difficulty is, how do you find out that they have a pot of money for vocational education in Tanzania? And even if you read the materials, it may not be very clear because it may be described in terms that only make sense to somebody who speaks the bureaucratic language of the World Bank, and only somebody within the World Bank may know. I'm not generalizing about the World Bank as a whole. There's all sorts of pots, some of which are much more open. But there are certainly some things where only somebody who's working on the education sector for the World Bank in Tanzania would be able to, if you happen to know that person, they may be able to explain to you that money is potentially applicable to something you would want to do. So that makes it sort of potentially hard to access, either very hard to access that type of funding or very easy. If it's worth trying to establish some relationships with, if you're working in a country on a long-run basis, it may be worth establishing a relationship with the World Bank people working in that country, because there may be, if they have an interest in research, and many of them do. A lot of them are PhD economists who are quite interested in research. Others have no interest in it, but it's probably worth feeling those people out, and there may be, there may be opportunity to support some of your work. There's the Gates Foundation, which particularly for health work, but not just health, also microfinance and other things, is a big funder in development. Again, they're really not, they're into scientific research, developing new vaccines, but their social science research is not what they're about. So it would be incidental if you happen to qualify, but you might, particularly if you're doing certain areas. So because these latter two funders are very much about development rather than about research, your proposal, relative to, say, a proposal you'd write for the National Science Foundation, you have to spend a lot of time talking about how will you disseminate the results within the country. And they're going to care also a lot about capacity building within the country. I don't mean to claim that these things aren't at all important to the NSF. There are analogous things that are important to the NSF, but I think the relative weights, my impression at least, is the relative weights are very high for relative to what you might be used to for some of these other funders. Another thing is that these funders they like co-financing. Okay? So I think it's very much like co-authorship. Right? If there's 2 or 3 authors on something and you add up the credit they each get, it sums to more than one. Similarly, if the World Bank is funding part of it and NIH is funding part of it and USAID is funding part of it, they can all claim credit to their bosses for helping get this done. And there's another advantage of co-financing, I think, bureaucratically, which is you won't get in that much trouble if you can say, well, if the World Bank person can say, well, I think it must have been scientifically good because NIH approved it. So there can be sort of hurting effects of that type. And that means that you can often have a sequence of funders. So you may well, particularly for projects that go on for a while and are expensive, you may get some funding initially from one funder and then funding from other funders later on. One other thing about this is the people who read these don't speak, they don't necessarily, who judge these don't necessarily speak economics jargon. So you should think about, what language you use. And of course, they may use their own language, which we may have to learn. An example of this was somebody who was, coming out of behavioral economics literature and was interested in working on sex workers, talked about the self-control problems of sex workers. And the reviewers thought this was incredibly politically incorrect, and that wasn't, that in fact, they were just using the standard behavioral economics term. So, you choose your language carefully when you write. Okay. Okay. There's a lot of. I want to talk some about the approval process. Obviously, one thing that we're familiar with, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, is human subjects approvals. So those you'd think of primarily on the U.S. side, but there may also be approvals to go through in the country where you're working. They can take a lot of time. So it's important to, when you work out your timelines and your plan, to budget for that. Don't set yourself up in a situation where your survey has to start at a certain date without that date being far enough away to go through multiple iterations with the human subjects people. There are some issues that are going to be different in a developing country and developed country context, a variety of them, but let me point to one, which is oral versus written consent. There may be many cases, so written consent would obviously be the standard in a developed country context. In a case where people are illiterate, you may want to go to oral consent. There's a second reason why oral consent might be appropriate, which is if people are sort of partially literate, they may be able to sign their name, but they may be very afraid that if they're signing their name to something, they're signing away their land or something like that. And so the whole idea of consent is quite standard to us, but it's quite alien in these settings. You have to do it as a human subjects requirement, but it's something that, because it's alien, people may be scared to sign their name, not because they're not happy to answer the questionnaire, but because they're worried about what else it implies. I've generally found that if you talk to the Human Subjects Committee about this, that they're flexible, but I'm sure that varies from Human Subjects Committee to committee. Okay. There are other permissions. So there's permission from the national government. There's also permissions from local authorities. So it's often the case that if you're working in a district, there's often a matrix organization to a government in a developing country. So there'll be somebody in charge of a district, and then there'll be somebody in charge of education. Then there'll be an education ministry. So typically, you need to visit these people. If you're, you can't just go to the national government and get your study on education approved. You probably also, in each of the districts you're working, you have to go visit the district commissioner as well and the district education officer. That's a time-consuming process, but it can actually, first, if you don't do it, you're going to wind up with more problems later on because the headmaster is going to say, I can't do this without a letter from the district education officer, even though you've got a letter from the national government. But second, you can actually make use of these as key informants. So when you're visiting them, in some cases, they can help you find the people that you're looking for. That might not be so relevant for schools, but it might be relevant if you've got a list of households and you're trying to find them. The assistant chief in the area might be able to take you around to find them. In fact, they might even be able to get them to come to their office so you can interview them there. Those guys may be quite upset if you skip them. They don't want people messing around in their area without stopping their office first. And if you're going to talk to them, you might as well collect some information from them. So if you collect, and they may be much better at answering certain questions. So I haven't found this a problem, but I know some people who are working in poorer and less developed countries than Kenya. People have, rural people may have trouble estimating distances to say the local hospital or the capital or things like that. But the head of the local government presumably is going to be more able to do that. So, okay. Let me, let me wind things up here. So I've sort of gone through a lot of areas where, a lot of things that can go wrong and sort of mentioned a lot of steps that you have to take to deal with them. So these things, as I said earlier, do tend to be a huge amount of work to implement. On the other hand, if you think about the list of papers that I talked about earlier, these are things that are clearly having a very big intellectual impact. There are also things that are very much having a real-world policy impact, and are in some cases. Just to give an anecdote from my own experience, one of the things that we worked on was trying to understand why kids aren't in school who are in school. And we looked at a whole variety of different things, a whole variety of different programs, working with a nonprofit organization in Kenya. Everything from paying for school uniforms, which households had to buy, school meals. Turned out the thing that made the most difference was treating kids for worms. And this, you could treat these kids for worms. For the medicine costs 2 pennies a day. Huge proportion of kids are infected. And this is something that, first, you probably, if you were thinking about this abstractly, not spending time in the field, you probably wouldn't even have gotten onto your list. Spending time in the field sort of gets it onto your list. And then once it's on your list, doing this sort of field work can establish it, can establish the fact in ways that deal with causality, but also can establish them in ways that are very convincing to policymakers. And with that evidence, obviously in some cases things will be politically, you're not going to be able to, you can have all the evidence in the world and it's not going to make a difference to policy. But if you have something like this that's very cheap, that's not particularly politically controversial, this is something that if you have the right policymakers in place, they may listen to it. And as in particular in this case, the government of Kenya decided to scale up a treatment for worms and just treated 3 million kids. So this is an example of how this sort of field work can have very big impact in the real world. And I at least find that despite all of the work involved, it's worth doing. So let me end there, and maybe we can have some discussion and questions. I'll talk more about experiments in the afternoon. Yes?
I wonder whether you can elaborate on the fact that maybe there is a way to use some of this field work to be kind of almost a complement to surveys rather than kind of being substitute. And if you have ideas on how this can help, so that also other people maybe can also benefit from the field survey without actually doing it.
Yeah, that's a great point. So first, I think there can be a lot of complementarity between field work and use of administrative data. So again, let me give an example from my own experience. Columbia did a school voucher program. And the school voucher program, they randomized the school voucher program not for research reasons, but for fairness reasons. We wanted to collect data on what the impact of this was, so we did some field work. We surveyed some people, et cetera. This was very expensive, very time-consuming, high, we had pretty high attrition rates. We were able to get lists of the people who'd originally applied to this voucher and compare the lottery winners and losers, so very nice identification. But when we were trying to get test score impacts, we got a sample of people, we brought them into a testing center, gave them tests, but we had a lot of attrition in that, and it was a relatively small sample size. Okay? Later, so we had some results, but you can argue about how convincing they were. Later, we were able to link this data to data from the National High School Graduation Exam that Columbia provides, and there we weren't able. There we were able to basically find out whether people got through high school or not. So we had a much larger sample, much lower attrition, much lower cost to do the same thing. So I think linking up with either administrative data or survey data, can be very valuable. Let me mention another thing in response to your question, which is one thing that I think people who do this sort of field work should do, and they're probably not as good at it as they should be, is get the data out and publicly available, so that a survey can initially be done for one purpose, but other people may be able to use that data for other purposes. People who are not able in a position to do this do field work themselves, and there can be lots of reasons, personal reasons. If you've got family and kids, you may not be able to spend that much time in the field. Why people? But there's it would be. I think making that data available to other people would be very socially beneficial. One of the a little bit of a digression, but one other point I wanted to make is there are lots of areas in which the institutions of the profession are not set up optimally to incentivize things. That's one example. There's the rewards for getting the data out and publicly available in a timely fashion are not as big as they should be. It takes work to do. Normally it's part of a grant proposal, but people take longer to do it than they should. And I'm certainly guilty of that myself. So, was that answering your question, or is there more?
I sometimes also wonder whether this field data can really complement well some big survey where maybe there is not enough information on
right.
preferences and so on, and so they can also enrich the existing data set in certain directions.
Right, so you're thinking maybe a survey is going on, a national sample survey, and you could go re-interview some of the same people in that survey. Yeah, I think that could potentially be very valuable. You obviously need to get cooperation from the people who did the original big national sample survey. Yes?
Michael, could you say a little bit about how much one can expand the team of researchers and bring in interns or early-stage graduate students or pre-graduate students
Yeah.
to do this? Having watched my colleagues at the Poverty Action Lab at MIT do this, I know that there's a active program of bringing people often after they finish as undergraduates, sending them out into the field
Right.
to do this. And I'm just curious as to at what level can you basically bring someone like that into this operation, and how much can you delegate in the process of doing this
Yeah, another great question. So on the section on data, I think I managed, I don't know if I skipped that slide accidentally, but there's survey firms that collect data. Those survey firms often don't do a very good job. And we can think of all sorts of contracting reasons why, from that branch of economics, why this would be a difficult relationship. You're asking them to do a lot of things that are not very directly observable. It's often a one-shot game. They don't necessarily, do that great work. And many of their clients don't need work done to the same standard that academics do. They're often they work for firms that sort of trying to get some sense of, how much demand for fans or air conditioners there might be in rural India, and they just want to get some rough sense of what proportion of people, own those objects or are thinking about them. So in that, so I think some people use survey firms successfully, but even in that case, they have to have people on the ground monitoring them very closely, where it's more of an employment relationship rather than a contractual relationship. What most of the researchers in this area do, or I don't say most, the other strategy that many researchers use is they have their own teams, sort of who are more or less regular employees, down to maybe not down to the level of the lowest level enumerators, but certainly supervisors who are working on one project after another. Certainly in my own work, I've done a lot of work in Kenya, many different projects, and there's enumerators who have worked on many of these projects. In those settings, it's pretty common to have people who come after either grad students or postdocs or often people straight out of undergrad who've taken undergrad classes and done very well, who go spend time working on this and spend a couple of years in the country. The other thing that I think is very important to do and is to work with collaborators in the country, and they're likely to have the best, much deeper understanding of the institutions than somebody who's going over for 2 years after finishing at Stanford. I mean, some of those people from Stanford are great, but it's also good to have collaborators who are based permanently in the country. Yes? Right. So one thing I would say, part of the reason for these lectures, of course, is to try and get some of the more obvious pitfalls, sort of warn people about. But there's always more of them. And so first, it's possible if you're a PhD student at the LSE, it may well be that there's a researcher at MIT who would love to have you working on his or her project. So Poverty Action Lab at MIT does a lot of, it's obviously a center at MIT, but it's also a center that provides services for a lot of people working, not in field work in developing countries in general, but randomized evaluations. So researchers who are affiliated with JPAL, whether or not they're based at MIT, will often advertise for positions there. And so if you're coming from the LSE, if you're a grad student, obviously there are people, if you're a grad student at the LSE, there are plenty of development economists to work with there. But you can, if for some reason you want to work on a particular project that somebody at MIT is doing, you can, or somebody at Harvard or Berkeley is doing, you can advertise, you can respond to one of those ads. There are many cases, so look, a lot of people do this through this sort of apprenticeship system that you've talked about, but not all of them by any means. So, there's let me, thinking about my own experience, I'm working in Western Kenya. Ted Miguel was originally did some, was an undergrad at MIT, and now he's a professor at Berkeley and is doing research there and had sort of had that apprenticeship system. But Ben Olken, for example, he had spent a year living in Indonesia before he started grad school, and then he went back to Indonesia and did an extremely large-scale randomized evaluation there. And it wasn't as if he had spent time sort of working as an apprentice, as an RA on a project in Kenya or India beforehand. And there are many examples like that as well. So, so it's It can make things easier, but it's not necessary. Yes?
I had a couple of questions. One was on the documentation of the data after it's collected.
Right.
And you must be aware that at the World Bank, the International Household Survey Network has a very nice microdata documentation toolkit which can import stuff and create a DDI-compliant file that also identifies where you've got gaps in the documentation. So I found that extremely useful. And then the other one that I wondered whether you might want to address, when I worked for the World Bank collecting data on businesses, one of the problems I had with the statistical institutes with getting a frame for business surveys was they were very concerned about confidentiality. And so, we developed a checklist to reassure the institute that we would protect the confidentiality of the data. And some of that material is also available on that International Household Survey Network. So I didn't know whether you wanted to comment a bit about how you reassured individuals and businesses of confidentiality.
So thanks, those are very helpful comments. And maybe there's a way that, I don't know what the procedures here are at the Bureau, but maybe there's a way we can get some sites to those and put them on the web so that people who see this can reference that. On assuring people about confidentiality, so clearly there's consent statements in interviews, and there can be, obviously there should be procedures for how you handle the data as well. Most of my work has been with individuals and relative, sort of farmers who tend not to be quite as concerned about this as, larger as businesses clearly would be. And, the larger the business, probably the more concerned they'll be. I would say that in developing countries, there's generally more willingness to work with researchers than in richer countries, is my general experience. But I'm sure there's plenty of counterexamples to that as well. Yes?
Just to add to that, it seems that researchers have not really paid enough attention to what we call harmonization. That is, questions that are trying to get at the same idea being asked in a similar wording and a similar structure. There's a lot of learning that's already happened in the field, and yet over time what I find is people feel like they need to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
And of course some of it's going to be local. You can't ask certain questions of certain cultures and so on. But we've already translated into multiple languages a whole host of questions.
Yeah.
And I've worked primarily with the HRS, but also now in Chile. And some of the questions are already out there. It would be great if there was a centralized locale of the questions with the concepts they're trying to get at. And so then people could almost do like a web-based click, pull down, here are the questions on risk aversion.
Right.
I would like to ask that have been tested in the literature attached to those questions to measure those concepts.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's a lot of reinventing the wheel that goes on, and some local adaptation is sometimes local adaptation is not needed, but I think there's this is another area where we probably need some institutions or slightly different incentives than we currently have. At the same time, it's worth noting that there are some data sets out there that are very nicely comparable across societies. So, DHS data is available in a lot of countries, and it's pretty easy to run a regression with data from 40 countries using that data set, for